Hello, welcome back to Control-Alt-Doodle. Today I'm going to be setting up my bullet journal for March, and continuing on with the indie game theme, I went with Papers, Please for the game for this month. And, yeah, a little bit late again, sorry about that, but better late than never. So the first thing I wanted to do for this setup was to make it look as much like a pile of papers and documents as I possibly could. And so the first thing I did was to make the first couple pages here look like a file folder, which I cut into shape and then used some corner rounders. And then I started using this distress ink, which is one of my favorite things to use. And you just rub it very lightly around the page and it just gives it so much character and depth. So I didn't use a ton here, but I did cover the whole folder area with this very light, I think it's called linen color. And by focusing mostly on the edges, it really gives it a nice aged feel without going crazy overboard. The next thing I did was to take this wood pattern paper and I attached it to the front page. My idea here was to make it look like the desk that all the papers were going to be sitting on. So I cut the page in half. We're going to use the other half for the other side of the desk later on. And we're just going to glue it down, cut it to shape, and then add some more of that distress ink on the wood in a slightly darker brown color this time. Once I was happy with that, I took some grid paper that I just tore up into a little scrap and sort of taped it to the front of the file folder with some washi tape. And then we're going to use these awesome typewriter letter stamps to just put March 2023 on the front. Next, I die cut this little tag, which I wanted to look like one of the identity supplements that you sometimes have to check in the game. And so, yeah, I die cut it into shape and then used these letter stamps just for the top part. And then the rest of it, I didn't want it to be super detailed so that you would read the whole thing. So I kept the little blocks where they would be and then just used a Tombow brush pen to sort of make the shapes of where the words would go and then little scribbles for what would fill in. And then finally I put a little thumbprint on there just to complete the whole look. So then it looks like the ID supplements from the game, but you don't focus on what it says specifically. And then I decided to make these Aristotelica tickets that I could stick around various pages. Next, to add a little bit more texture and detail to the desk background, I used this big sort of cursive letter stamp that you can't really read, but I guess it's not the point. It's more just to give a little bit more depth and dimension. And I stamped that on with the same brown distress ink so it sort of blends in. Once I was happy with the placement of the ID supplement and the ticket, we just glued those on. And then this page was nearly ready to go. I just used a little bit more washi tape from my mom's excellent collection of washi tapes. Add some ones that look like tickets and like maps, and just added a little bit of extra character to the page. Finally, just using the Sakura pen number 1 size to add a little bit of detailing to the file folder so it just looks a little bit more finished. Now we're going to move on to the calendar page, which is pretty straightforward, but I really like how it turned out. So the calendar is going to go inside of the file folder here. And I just wanted to do some very simple lines across. I didn't need to do the vertical lines to divide it up. I just think it looks a little bit neater this way. And then using my typewriter stamps again, and some red ink, I just stamped the days of the week along the top. And then we're going to use some number stamps to stamp the days of the month as well. Then on the back of the file folder, I took another ripped scrap piece of grid paper that I typed down with some washi tape, and this I'm going to use for my goal tracking. So I had a little bit more of the distress ink just around the edge of the paper so that it stands out from the background. And then we're just going to stamp 1, 2, and 3, where I can write down the goals that I wanted to focus on for the month. Next up, I really wanted to have some interactive parts of this spread because I felt like that was the best way to evoke the feeling of playing Papers, Please. So I found these old manila envelopes in an old cupboard that we have, and I really wanted to use them, but it didn't quite fit in the journal. So I decided I would take one and sort of cut it down to size. But first I wanted to cut the page so that I could glue the folder onto it and then have empty space behind it. So I marked out with my ruler how big I needed the envelope to be for it to fit onto that page that I cut, and then added a little bit of space so that I could recreate the bottom fold. And the way I did that was just measured the existing bottom fold and then traced it onto the top part of the envelope, and then cut away the edges and the top side of the envelope so that the bottom one could fold over really nicely. And I was so impressed with how this ended up looking. I really didn't think it was gonna turn out quite this well, but there we go. It worked out. Once the envelope was ready, I glued it into my journal, and it fit right on that little page that I cut out. And then the next thing to do was to make something to go inside the envelope. And what I had wanted to do was basically create a passport, which I could then keep my media content for the month in there. I like to write down any books, movies, things like that that I would like to check out that month, and then also any highlights of the month. So to make the passport, I took some green scrap cardstock that I found, and then added some dot grid paper that I cut out of this pad here, and just glued it into the inside of the cardstock, which I had cut to fit inside the little envelope that we had made. Once that was glued in, we just added a little bit of a border and then stamped in the titles for the 2 sections that I wanted to include in the passport. Really love these typewriter stamps. I've used them so much in this setup, and they worked just perfectly for the theme. And then finally, for the front cover, using a silver gel pen, I just recreated the cover of an Aristotska passport as you would see it in the game. So with the little eagle bird thing on the front, and then just wrote Passport and People's Republic of Aristotska. Now, I don't think this was really perfect the way it turned out, but I also didn't mind so much because it's gonna, most of the time, live inside the little envelope that I made, and it looks close enough to the sort of pixel art version from the game that I didn't really mind. Once I was happy with that, I started on another interactive element, which is going to be my gratitudes, positivities page. So I took just a piece of printer paper and cut the edges with this paper cutter. Took a couple of attempts, but we got there in the end. And my idea here was just to have something that could be folded out to look like one of the many permits that you have to check in the game. So after I drew a border on it, I folded it into three so that it could be unfolded nicely. And then we're just going to stamp gratitudes across the top because I forgot that I had renamed the section positivities last time. But, I mean, it's used for the same thing anyway. And then I just numbered all the days of the month along the side of the page. Finally, I took this seal stamp and just used some red ink to stamp it on the page and then on the folded side as well. And then we're going to glue this onto the back of the envelope. But first I thought I wanted a little bit more decoration behind it, so I used that same cursive lettering stamp just to fill in the background behind it, and then glued our little form on the top. Once again, added some distress ink just around the edges, and it really adds so much character and depth, and also added a little bit more washi tape as well. Onto the trackers page, and if you've watched my videos before, you'll know that I like to use my trackers for various mental health symptoms that I like to keep track of, and then also my medication, make sure I'm taking it. And yeah, so I used the grid paper again. I had another scrap ready to go. So I marked out just where I wanted the trackers themselves to go and glued it onto another page which I cut to size. And then what I'm doing here is I'm using some post-it notes that I found, which I'm going to use to mask the squares where I want to have the trackers, because my idea was to use these big background stamps. Like this first one is going to be typewriter font block of text, which I used quite a few times so you can't actually read any of it, and then also a little grid stamp in the bottom corner. And by masking off where I want the trackers to be, I can guarantee that the stamps will only go around them and I'll have clear space in the middle. After taking the post-it notes off, I just used a Sakura #1 size pen to outline the boxes, and used a little gray Tombow brush pen to block out the days of the month that don't exist, really, so that I could keep track of it like a calendar. And then once again, we're going to use the typewriter letter stamps to just label the boxes for what I'm going to use them for. Finally, we're going to move on to the weekly setup, and my idea here was to make it look like the sort of reference guide book that you can use throughout the game, full of maps and what the passports are supposed to look like and all that kind of stuff. So I decided to cut the pages down and add little tabs along the side just so I can find which week I'm on easily. I just rounded the edge of the tabs with my scissors and then did the same for all 4 other pages. Now we're going to add the other half of that wood paper that I was using at the beginning to just complete the other side of the desk, which we're going to glue down, cut to size, and then use more of that dark brown distress ink around the edges just so it matches the first side. Next, to make the book, I found this paper that sort of looked like leather, and I decided to add that to the front and back of the weekly spreads, just so it would look like a book that's laying open. So we're going to glue those down and then use the rest of the scrap dot grid paper that I had to just put that on top of the back of the book, back and front, so that I can have actual full weeks that I can use on those pages. Once again, distress ink all over the place, the front and back of the book, and there's going to be some on all the pages in between as well. I took another piece of scrap grid paper, I had quite a bit of it, and I decided to tape it into the front with washi tape and use this as my note-taking section. I like to have an area that just left blank for anything I want to use it for throughout the month. And by taping it in like this, I thought it sort of looked like scrap paper that someone had taped into a book, which I mean is literally what it is. But it was a cool effect. Then I set up my weeks the same way I always do. I like to use mine for a daily to-do list, so it doesn't make much sense to change up the weekly setup very much. So I just do a column for every day of the week, and then the weekend gets half columns. Then I used my stamps again to stamp the days of the week, and the beauty of using stamps for this is that you can do the whole month setup in one go, which is pretty handy. You don't have to come back to it later. And then I just used my other Aristotska ticket to complete the bottom here and a little bit more washi tape. And that's it for the setup. So we're going to flip through the whole thing. I was so unbelievably impressed with how this turned out. I really like having all the tactile, interactive elements of the spread. It really feels like Papers, Please, which was sort of what I was going for. Yes, I really hope you like this as well, and hope to see you in the next video. Hopefully it won't be as late next time, and I'll see you in the next one.